The conventional dating of the plays fit Shakespeare's life. He could have written them. Though the Anti-Stratfordians wonder how such a polished piece of work like Venus and Adonis could have all sprung onto the public in 1593 without any previous works showing the development of a beginner. All at once, there it was, one of the greatest works of art ever produced. I might add, however, here, though, that we do see progression in Shakespeare's plays. During the years that I've been going to Stratford, we've seen the Comedy of Errors, which is a very delightful play. But it's obviously the work of a playwright who was learning his craft, and it does not compare in its quality with Much Ado About Nothing or with Twelfth Night, which was written some 5 or 6 years later. So we do see a progression. And then the play Titus Andronicus, which is about the theme of revenge, was written in one of his early years, and it obviously does not compare in quality with another play about revenge, which we have just seen, namely Hamlet. A tremendous progression. So there was progression, but we can still ask what was he doing to get ready to write Venus and Adonis? Most Anti-Stratfordians focus on the Stratford Shakespeare's educational deficiency. There is no evidence whatsoever that he ever went to school, and some people doubt that he ever did. Stratford in those days was not the Stratford that I'm sure that many of you have visited, that beautiful town, tremendously commercialized on the banks of the Avon. It is a delightful experience to go to Stratford on Avon and see the memorials to the Stratford Shakespeare. But in 1594, or 1564, it was a barren, filthy, impoverished little provincial town. That's the kind of place that Shakespeare was born. I think the Anti-Stratfordians are often a little bit rough on this Shakespeare of Stratford. They call him a bumbling country bumpkin, that even if he did attend school, it was obviously one of poor quality. And it's just insane to think that any Oxford professor would be going down there to teach in that school. So that it doesn't provide the kind of education that we see reflected in the Shakespeare plays. Well, how can you explain that this man wrote it? And of course, the answer that almost everybody gives is, he was a genius. And that explains it. He was simply a genius. That explains Mozart, for example. How did this little boy begin producing this wonderful works of musical composition? Because he was a genius. And the word genius means that we simply can't understand how a person could do whatever it was that he had done. However, even a genius does need to have some kind of background to work from. He may do wonderful and impossible things when he gets that background, but he needs the background, and so the Anti-Stratfordians say he didn't have it. Ben Jonson, for example, said that good poets are made as well as born, suggesting that you do have to have something behind you. The conventional scholars argue further that the fact that there is no record that Shakespeare ever went to school doesn't mean that he didn't go to school, and I think we'd all agree with that. Rouse even speculates, as Brian Bedford did, about who some of his schoolmasters might have been. Some think that he made up for the lack of educational opportunity in Stratford by going to school in London. And one of the most difficult parts of this controversy is the fact that during those 8 or 9 years from 1593 on, from 1585 to 1593, we don't have any idea what Shakespeare was doing. He might have been doing any number of things. He might have been going to school. He might have been going to the Oxford University. He might have been studying law. He might have been doing all of these other things, but we don't have any way of knowing for sure that he did it. And the reason that the conventional scholars say that he must have done these things is because that sort of thing is reflected in the play. And thus you see this kind of circular reasoning going on all the time, that the Shakespeare plays reflect a great knowledge of the law. Therefore, the person who wrote them, Shakespeare of Avon, must have studied law someplace, but you're going around in circles, and one point does not prove the other. Other people say that he didn't have to go to school at all, that a genius could pick up information on his own. And I think there's a lot to be said for that kind of an explanation, that there are, we've seen that in our children, that some of them seem to learn things that we don't teach them, some that we don't want them to learn, but that they do pick up things on their own without having it formally presented to them in a school. Well, there's no evidence then that Shakespeare studied law, but he may well have studied it. He may, as some think, he may have been a law clerk. There's no record that he ever went abroad. It doesn't seem that he went abroad after 1593. It seems there might have been some record of it if it had happened after that. But it's possible, I think, very possible, that he went abroad from in those blank years when we have no information about him. He may have journeyed to Italy, for example. Now, this, I think, is one of the major questions. Shakespeare of Stratford was obviously not a nobleman. Then the question arises, with the sharp class distinctions that existed in England in his time, and that still exist to a certain degree, how could this person, this provincial from Stratford, have possibly gotten to know on a very intimate basis the Earl of Southampton? Because it's generally concluded by conventional scholars that he was the fair youth who figures in the sonnets. And Shakespeare, the writer of Adonis, Venus and Adonis, and The Rape of Lucrece, dedicated those works to the Earl of Southampton. And that, I think, is a very interesting question. How could he possibly have gotten to know a person of that rank? Some think that the relationship between them was homosexual, but others believe that it was more that of a patron to a younger man. And Shakespeare would have been the patron because he was 4 or 5 years older. But is a difference of 4 or 5 years enough to explain the kind of relationship that is reflected in the sonnets? Also, was Shakespeare old enough to justify the lines that we find in Sonnet 62, where the writer says, "But when my glass shows me myself indeed, beaten and chopped with tanned antiquity," it's difficult to believe that that could be describing a person of Shakespeare's age. On the other hand, and this is full of on the other hands, people aged faster in those days than they do now. And I think I think certainly that the age of 52, you're still a kid. And it's difficult to believe that that could be the age at which people were expected to pass on, and yet we all know that people died much earlier in those days than they do now. So maybe that perception of what we look on as age now and what it really was in those days is warped, and perhaps does explain this relationship, and that 5 years between Shakespeare and Southampton would be a more considerable difference than it would seem to be now. I think there's no question that the criterion that I've mentioned that best fits Shakespeare of Avon is the fact that the writer of the plays knew about theater. Shakespeare of Avon of Stratford definitely did. He was an actor. He was a shareholder in the various theater companies that he helped organize. There is no record of the parts that he played anywhere, but one of the persistent legends is that he played the part of the ghost in Hamlet. I don't know what the basis for that is. There's another part that he supposedly played, and that was the part of Adam in As You Like It. But there is a very specific historical record of his performances, of his work as an actor, that he was an actor, not any of the parts he played. The harshest criticism of the Anti-Stratfordians is that the Shakespeare of Stratford, and we've mentioned this before, could not possibly be the elevated, sophisticated, literary person who wrote the plays. One of these writers called him a money-grubbing usurer. He sued people, as I've indicated, for very small sums. Shakespeare's plays were widely pirated during his lifetime. People just took and produced them without his receiving any payment. And the question is asked, would a man who sued somebody for 2 shillings be willing to let the piracy of his plays go on without any contention at all? And yet there's no record that this Shakespeare ever objected to that piracy. When he retired to Stratford, he became a dealer in money and malt. He showed no further interest that we know of in any intellectual or literary matters. That is strange, isn't it? Would the death of such a titanic figure as Shakespeare go unnoted except for a few town records? His passing didn't call forth the kind of recognition that were accorded to other literary figures of his time who were of much lesser rank. His children grew up illiterate. Would Shakespeare, who wrote Hamlet, have been willing for that to happen? These are the kinds of questions that are asked about Shakespeare of Stratford. At this point, I suppose, one may well ask how this name of Shakespeare became attached to these literary works.